I'm Adélie Pojzman-Pontay, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, we talk about air defense systems, some developed by Ukraine and others provided by the UK in the 100-year partnership signed last week, and we look ahead at the beginning of the second Trump era, starting later today in Washington.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
It's the worst carnage that this world has seen since World War II.
Absolutely fascinating.
We are with you, not just today or tomorrow, but for 100 years.
Nous ne pouvons pas, comme Européens, laisser gagner la Russie en Ukraine.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Monday, the 20th of January, 2 years and 325 days since the full-scale invasion began. I'm joined by the Telegraph's Associate Editor for Defence, Dom Nicholls, Francis Dearnley, Executive Editor for Audio, and Joe Barnes, the Telegraph's Brussels correspondent.
Let's go back over the weekend. Firstly, from Friday, it was announced after we put out our episode, Ukraine's Special Ops Forces said they'd located and targeted Russian soldiers responsible for executing 2 Ukrainian prisoners of war. Now, according to the unit, several were killed, 3 captured, with the detainees reportedly providing information to the Ukrainian forces. The Russian soldiers had allegedly taken 2 Ukrainian Territorial Defence Force fighters captive a few days earlier, later executing them on the orders of their company commander. Now, Special Operations Forces put that report up. Kyiv Independent put it out, and that went out after Friday's episode, as I said. Then on Saturday, Ukraine's General Staff said that Russian forces had used ammunition equipped with chemical agents that's banned by the Chemical Weapons Convention 434 times in Ukraine in December last year alone, contributing to, nearly 5,389 to be exact, contributing to 5,389 documented cases of the use of chemical weapons banned by the CWC since February 2023. That information was from the ISW Institute for the Study of War. So Monday, bang up to date today, Ukrainian forces attacked oil depots in Russia's Tula and Kaluga oblasts overnight Sunday, Monday. Those areas both to the south of Moscow, but still each of them a few hundred kilometres north of Ukraine. A source in the HUR, Ukraine's military intelligence department, speaking to Kyiv Independent, said they'd hit the oil depot in Tula Oblast at least 10 times in the attack. Tula Oblast Governor Dmitry Miliev said that a fuel storage tank caught fire at one of the enterprises in the region. No casualties reported, but videos on social media appear to show a large fire at an oil depot in the town of Uzlovaya. That's in Tula, about 600 km north of Kharkiv. Now, Kyiv also said the oil depot in the Russian town of Ludinovo in Kaluga Oblast was hit. That's 200 km north of the most northern point of Ukraine, so kind of centre of the country, north border there, keep going north, 200 kilometres, that's where Ludinovo is. No imagery I've found on that across social media, no reports of casualties. But along with the oil depots in Engels and Lysky to the north and the northeast of Ukraine, you'll remember, that makes 4 major attacks by Ukrainian forces on Russian oil infrastructure just in a week. Now, also this morning, it's reported that the Kazan aviation plant in the city of Kazan in Russia's Tatarstan Republic, right over in the east near Kazakhstan, is on fire after an overnight drone attack. Videos posted on social media appear to show a large blaze following what's thought to have been a drone attack. Multiple explosions were reported in the city about 5:30 a.m. local time today. Kyiv Independent says that plant, which was sanctioned by the European Union in 2023, makes the big Tupolev Tu-160 and Tu-22 long-range bombers, among other aircraft. Now, a nearby airfield seems to also have been targeted in that strike. There's no reports, battle damage reports or casualty reports from there. It's very difficult to verify any of that anyway. But 3 local civilian airfields, including the Kazan International Airport, did have to suspend flights. Now, a couple more. Ukraine is working on developing its own air defence systems, including a programme said to match the US-made Patriot air defences. This comes from Commander-in-Chief Alexander Syrsky. He gave an interview to the Ukrainian news outlet TSN yesterday. He said, back in Soviet times, we actually produced all the control systems for anti-aircraft systems. That is, we have the capacities and capabilities to create, and we're working on creating our own domestic air defense complex. Now, Ukraine aims to spend about $35 billion on weapons production this year, according to Defense Minister Rustem Umerov. The Ukrainian government will put in $17 billion, and the rest financed by allies. There's various programs that we've spoken about on this pod for providing cash to Ukraine to then go to the open market rather than gifting equipment itself. Now, on that, and a comment I put my hands up, I missed last week, President Zelensky, speaking, I think on Wednesday, said Ukraine now produces about a third of its weapons requirement. That's up from about 10% at the time of the start of the full-scale invasion. President Zelensky said that Europe and the US each account for about a third of the remainder. So Ukraine a third, Europe a third, US a third. But that shows the scale of the problem, just in materiel terms, that would come about should there be any US disengagement with Ukraine, shall we say. Now, elsewhere in that interview with TSN, General Syrskyi said Russia's ammunition use has been cut nearly in half as a result of Ukrainian strikes on Russian military targets. He said industrial enterprises that produce ammunition, missile parts or dual-use products are targeted for destruction. We reported a few weeks ago that the shell ratio, particularly in 155mm ammunition for artillery systems, has come right down from about 8 or 9 to 1 throughout the whole of since the start of the full-scale invasion, i.e. for every 8 or 9 rounds Russia fires at Ukraine, Ukraine only has the capacity to fire 1 back. That's now down to at least, 3 to 1, and I've heard even 2 to 1 from Western officials. So all those long-range strikes on ammunition depots and what have you does seem to be paying off. Now, on the ground, Russian forces recently advanced slightly in Kursk Oblast to the southeast of the town of Sudzha, and also in Ukraine by a small distance to the north of Kupiansk. They've also advanced slightly to the northeast of Liman, on that to the oblast border there between Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts. And they also moved a little bit to the west of Kharkov. Now, Velika Novosilka, that we've spoken about numerous times recently, is now almost totally surrounded. There's just the northwest sector open. So imagine a clock face, the bit from Velika Novosilka in the middle of the clock, from 12 o'clock through 11:10 and down to 9 o'clock. That bit is open, but probably under fire control by Russia, i.e. they might not have forces there, but they could bring down accurate fire into that area. So Velika Novosilka, very, very precarious position at the moment. There's also been a lot of fighting and movement around Chasiv Yar and Toretsk. Ukrainian forces recaptured some lost positions, but Russia retook other ground in those areas, so it's still extremely violent there. Now, last night, Russia fired 141 drones at Ukraine. Sumy Oblast was also hit with an Iskander-M ballistic missile. That one was fired from Kursk Oblast somewhere. Now, of the 141 drones, 93 were shot down, 47 brought down by EW. I think that leaves 1. Don't know what happened to that last one. 2 civilians killed, 5 injured. There were glide bomb attacks also, including in Kharkiv, where thankfully there are only injuries. So it's worth noting that in his address last night, so that's before the launch of these 141 drones overnight, but last night President Zelensky said Russia had launched around 550 attack drones, nearly 60 missiles of various types, and more than 660 aerial bombs, those glide bombs, against Ukraine just last week. Now, that's incredible statistics, and I would never seek to deny the personal stories behind each of them, but just looking at those statistics and the amount shot down and the number of deaths and injuries caused by them, I wonder what it says about Ukraine's air defense capability, the whole capability. So the systems, the production, the training, the putting all that into an operation. I wonder if we can say that Ukraine has now nullified the threat from drones from Russia. Big call, I know, because that Oreshnik missile did land in Dnipro, but look at the statistics. And what is a threat for? A threat is there to force an adversary to change their behaviour. And I wonder, have these largely inconsequential Russian drone attacks forced the Ukrainian government to change their behaviour? Has it forced the people to change their attitude to the government and demand a ceasefire and what have you? I don't think there's any evidence for that. So I question whether or not these continued drone attacks by Russia is actually having any military effect whatsoever. I think it's just muscle memory. I think Russia only does it because they can, and they're out of ideas, and it's all they've got left. Now, last one for me, Adélie. Over the weekend, the first contingent of 550 Swedish troops arrived in Latvia to join NATO's Enhanced Forward Presence mission in that country. That EFP is led by Canada. So the EFP, just as a reminder, has 8 NATO brigades on what they describe as the eastern flank. Now, I've wondered before whether perhaps we should call that the front line, not rather than the eastern flank, because, why call it a flank if it's not got something on the other side, and what's on the other side of that? Anyway, I'm not going to get wrapped around the axle of that, but I do note that they still continue to call it the eastern flank of NATO. Anyway, a ship carrying parts of a mechanised infantry battalion arrived on Saturday in Riga, the Latvian capital. That was escorted by the Swedish Air Force and units from the Swedish and Latvian navies. That came out in a statement from the Swedish Armed Forces. And surprisingly, Adélie, given this is the most significant operation so far conducted by Sweden since it was helplessly gobbled up last March by the rampant and omnipotently expansionist NATO, the Swedish troops look happy to be there. Don't know what was going on there. Anyway, that's us up to date, Adélie.
Thanks, Dom. Do you reckon the Swedish troops have brought meatballs with them to Latvia?
Could well be the case.
Francis, I turn to you now for the diplomatic updates. It's obviously a really big day for the world today.
Well, thanks, Adélie. Yes, all eyes, of course, on Washington, D.C. today, where Donald Trump is about to be sworn in to his second term as President of the United States, only the second in history to serve a non-consecutive term. Away from the freezing conditions in the Capitol, so cold that the oaths will actually be sworn inside, something I don't think I've seen in my lifetime. There were a blizzard of orders Trump has now pledged to sign in recent days, stating yesterday that every radical and foolish executive order of the Biden administration will be repealed within hours of when I take the oath of office. Most of those are domestic, though there is an expectation that, just given the sheer number of them, that at the very least we will get a signal sooner rather than later of the approach the new administration will be taking towards Ukraine. In Friday's episode, in case you missed it, I spoke to Simon Schuster of Time magazine about what he's been hearing from insiders, with much speculation that the Republicans' primary objective is to avoid another Afghanistan-style humiliation like that President Biden suffered. That means many expect there may well be an upsurge of support for Kyiv, though it does remain too early to say. The Ukrainians, though, have made their view, we understand, very strongly behind closed doors, that forcing Kyiv to negotiate with Moscow before it regains the advantage on the battlefield would be a catastrophic mistake. Do stay with us this week, as I expect developments will come thick and fast. The decision by the British Prime Minister Keir Starmer to sign the 100-year pledge of support to Kyiv at the end of last week, just before the inauguration today, was, of course, an important political signal of support, not only to Kyiv and to European capitals, but also to Washington, I think. Though another aspect of it that was perhaps less discussed were the weapons pledges that were part of it. 150 UK-manufactured artillery barrels, along with additional air defence systems, all part of a secretive programme of air defence known as Gravehawk. Now, United 24 have written a very interesting summary of this development. I'm going to quote from it quite extensively now because I think it is interesting. There had been no prior information about this weapon, and almost nothing about it can be found online. The reason is not extraordinary secrecy, but rather the novelty of the development itself. These air defence systems were created specifically for Ukraine to address the lack of effective means for protecting its skies. The project was funded by the governments of the UK and Denmark. So what is it? They go on. This new system is approximately the size of a shipping container mounted on a Supercat truck chassis. The concept of Gravehawk involves launching air-to-air missiles in the format of an anti-aircraft system from the ground. The innovation lies in the use of aviation missiles, typically employed by fighter jets, from a mobile installation. Missiles are guided using a self-targeted system, simplifying the work for the team. This is not an entirely new solution, but rather an adaptation of existing systems to meet Ukraine's needs and capabilities. It utilises the same AIM-132 aviation missiles. Now, according to Starmer, 2 installations were tested in Ukraine in 2024, conducted in secret without any announcements from the General Staff, the UK Armed Forces or the Air Force Command. Since that performed well, the UK then decided to scale up the project. Now, another interesting feature of Gravehawk is its compatibility with R-73 missiles, projectiles previously launched from ground installations. When launched from a fighter jet, they had a range of up to 40 kilometres, while from a ground installation, their range is about 12 kilometres, we understand. Previously, those missiles were mounted on ground-based systems and gained further recognition when they successfully downed 2 Russian helicopters using a naval drone. Thus, this air defence system addresses several of Ukraine's needs. It provides mobile installations with a range of approximately 10 kilometres and the capability to utilise the R-73 missiles already available in Ukraine. So quite a fascinating piece, this, and we'll provide a link in the show notes to those interested in it. And do check out Thursday's episode, last Thursday's, for more information on what else was pledged as part of this new century-long alliance. Whenever I hear century-long alliance, I always think of that war, the 100 Years' War between England and France. But this, of course, is quite the reverse of that. But turning to Moscow and its allies, we flagged last week that despite the tensions between the two countries, Russia and Iran were set to sign new agreements of cooperation. Well, they just have, signing a 20-year strategic partnership agreement with political military elements of cooperation. One cannot help but wonder whether the 20-year aspect of it was thrown in an attempt to act as a kind of response to the Kyiv UK alliance, but as I say, that's just speculation on my part. In the treaty, Russia and Iran pledged to consult and cooperate to deal with the military and security threats of the time, as well as taking part in joint military exercises on both their territories and, rather more ominously, beyond. They also agreed not to allow their territories to be used for actions that threatened the other side. Now, during a joint news conference with his Iranian counterpart, Putin said his country was considering building new nuclear power units in Iran, though Moscow is also seeking to sell some of its surplus gas to Tehran, a sign of it needing new markets, of course, now that the EU is becoming increasingly difficult to sell to, even through the back door. A planned gas pipeline from Russia to Iran, which the countries are also said to be negotiating, will be laid through the territory of Azerbaijan, if realised. A big if, though, some would argue, given just how volatile things are at the moment. And just finally, since we're on energy, according to Reuters, Russia's seaborne exports of petroleum products declined by 9.1% in 2024. Ukraine has, of course, targeted Russia's fossil fuel infrastructure as part of its strategy to undermine the key funding source for Moscow's war effort. Those drone strikes on refineries that we've been reporting for months now have led to quite large reductions or suspensions in operations. But some of the numbers, as I say, are interesting. So Russian refineries reportedly processed approximately 267 million metric tons of oil in 2024, the lowest since 2012. Due to rising production costs, falling prices and an export ban on gasoline-strained operations. Exports through Baltic ports fell by 9%, while shipments via Black and Azov seaports dropped to 10%. Now, notably, exports from Tuapasi plummeted by a third to 9.1 million tonnes, largely due to the drone attacks and operational disruptions at state-owned Rosneft refineries. Arctic ports, including Murmansk, saw a 14% decline in exports, while Far Eastern ports experienced a 3% drop. So when you join all the dots together, you can see those parts of the infrastructure that have been most badly affected, whether it be by sanctions or whether it be by these bombardments. You can see also that Russia is being compelled to sign more and more agreements with those allies like Iran, like North Korea, who are themselves suffering under Western sanctions in order to try and bolster its own military and economic position. In that sense, do we read these alliances as coming from a position of strength, as Moscow likes to project, or rather from a position of increasing desperation? Either way, the alliance between Beijing, Moscow, Minsk, Pyongyang and Tehran is continuing to develop, which of course has ramifications far beyond the Ukrainian theatre. Those capitals too will be watching very closely what happens in the US this week, because the decisions made over the next few days will shape the world for decades to come.
Thank you, Francis. And worth noting that the AIM-132 is the ASRAAM Advanced Short-Range Air-to-Air Missiles. So they've tweaked the software and launch platforms to fire from the ground, which is very clever. And now I turn to Joe Barnes, the Telegraph's Brussels correspondent. Joe, you were at an event bringing together Western government officials and private businesses to help pave the way for a better strategy to tackle both the short and long-term challenges faced by Ukraine's health system. Can you tell us what you learned there?
No, fascinating event pulled together by DGA Group, a consultancy in Brussels and worldwide, working alongside the UK and Ukrainian government. So really interesting to see that everyone is, whether they be private or government entities, are getting together and actually butting their heads on such an interesting and important topic as healthcare, because it's often one that's overlooked. I was lucky enough to be invited on to the stage to interview some of the guests. And one of the ones I notably interviewed was Darina Smolnikova. She's a military officer in the Azov Brigade, and she is part of the medical unit. And she was talking us through the challenges, such as basically, look, what you guys have planned for in the West in terms of having a golden hour where you can get someone back from the front line via a helicopter to a surgeon within an hour to treat them. They've gone out the window. We've been forced to adapt constantly. She's been behind a brilliant campaign to change blood legislation to basically help transfusions and donations to aid battlefield medicine, which I found really interesting. But then the guest basically spoke through a series of challenges that have arisen in healthcare because of Russia's war on Ukraine. One of the obvious ones are like hospitals are being targeted. You'd think to the Children's Cancer Hospital in Kyiv and other medical facilities. But it's actually having lots of repercussions. So one of the things that people mentioned were these communicable diseases such as HIV and hepatitis B. They're actually on the rise. There is some policy thinking around actually, if these diseases that are spreadable, contagious, the more that Ukrainians travel and are basically forced out of their country, if they're infected by these diseases because of the war, it's going to become a public health problem, not just in Ukraine, but also in other countries. Non-communicable diseases like strokes and cancer are basically on the rise again because of there's preventative medicines not being addressed, primary care services aren't being addressed. Then you've got other things to look at like PTSD, mental health, hospice care for the elderly. They're all being overlooked because of, in terms of Ukraine just isn't able to sufficiently plug this gap at the moment while fighting a war, and the West actually needs to help out a little bit. But I've got this interview with a trauma surgeon with the NHS. He's going to talk us through more about that. But I think some other things that we've mentioned, there were some government officials speaking at the event, and they were saying, look, we need to actually create this opportunity to build back better in Ukraine. It not only helps us solve the moral problem of like actually helping a Western ally, but also it provides this brilliant platform for our companies to get involved and actually innovate. One of the other things I found really interesting is government agencies are finding it harder and harder and harder to convince not their governments, but their voters that international cooperation and international aid is important. So that's one thing. And then I think the one thing that really struck me is the long-term repercussions of so many wounded soldiers. We're going to have to turn to this generation of people whose health has been not disregarded, but has been probably overlooked by the West for probably generations to come.
Thanks, Joe. And obviously, a fortnight ago, we had spoken to Arthur Scott Giddis from our global health team here at the Telegraph about the threat of antibiotic-resistant superbugs coming out of war zones and other topics related to treating wounded soldiers in Ukraine. So building up on that conversation, Joe, you sat down with Dr Shehan Hettiaratchy, the lead trauma surgeon at Imperial College Healthcare. Dr Hettiaratchy has gone on several missions to Ukraine to train Ukrainian surgeons. He talks about how Ukrainian healthcare has had to adapt to the realities on the front line, what the West can learn from these challenges, and how each conflict brings its own unique set of medical lessons. Let's dive in.
Let's start with the current healthcare situation in Ukraine from your perspective. You've been involved in the support, you've carried out missions to Ukraine, you've trained Ukrainian surgeons. How's it developed?
So it's interesting. So I've been working there intermittently, doing various surgical missions since March 22, so pretty early on. And it's amazing to see how they have responded and developed and grown their capabilities and their capacity to meet the challenge. And the challenge is huge, right? The number of casualties we've got coming through, the types of casualties, the challenges they are facing are things we've not seen before, and the world hasn't seen before, because we haven't had this kind of peer-on-peer fighting at a full-scale war. We haven't seen that since the Second World War, basically, because everything else has been relatively asymmetric. You've had small powers going against large powers, or deformed armies going against loose-formed organizations. So this is a really unique, unprecedented situation in Europe since the end of the Second World War. They had some critical gaps within their infrastructure. They didn't have, for example, certain types of surgeons, certain types of therapists, or certain types of nurses, or infection control. And what we were doing is going, okay, you've asked us to help you around these areas. Well, let's help you try and fill those gaps, what you've got now, and build up the skills, build up the capabilities, and how are you going to deal with the capacity issues? And what they have done is taken that initial learning in that 18 months where we were kind of working with them and helping them develop, and they have basically learned their skills and now deploying them out and developing and amplifying them to meet the need they've got. What they haven't yet done and they're beginning to do, all credit to them, is think about, okay, there are some long-term consequences of what's going on in warfighting, in healthcare and other regions and other areas of provision. What do we need to do to make sure those people who have been affected by warfighting are maintained in healthcare, in health, well-being, functionality, contributing to society for the rest of their lives? Because obviously the scale of casualties they got, if they don't do that, these people then become a burden, and that will be a real drag on them societally as they re-establish their post-war economy.
One of the things I've learned from my reporting trips to Ukraine is often medics on the front line, and you can't really blame them for it, they're dealing and working in these incredibly difficult situations, but they are too quick to use a tourniquet. And I have only just learned about this, but tourniquet syndrome is apparently one of the long-term challenges that Ukraine faces with healthcare because it causes problems for kidneys. And there's questions over whether Ukraine has enough access to kit to deliver dialysis and stuff like that. Do you see Western approaches and help that you can offer in terms of level of helping?
Well, I mean, that thing you've highlighted, Joe, is almost the thing that kind of highlights where you can't translate what we learned in our small conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan and translate them automatically to the battlefield in Ukraine. Worked in the UK military in Afghanistan. I've worked in different war zones for civilian organizations. I'm a big advocate for tourniquets. They stop bleeding. They stop people dying. The US looked at their casualty deaths in Iraq at the start of the 2003 campaign and those initial peacekeeping afterwards. And they found about 25% of their casualty deaths were people exsanguinating from limbs that had been injured and people were bleeding out, that they could have been stopped with tourniquets. So they brought tourniquets in and tourniquets stopped that figure. Literally no one dies anymore from bleeding and from being shot in the arms or legs. So tourniquets per se are great. And the mantra we had when we were in war fighting in Afghanistan and Iraq was put tourniquets on. If you got injured, then put a tourniquet on, tighten it up, the guys on the combat medics on the ground, and then don't worry about it, leave it on. That is great if you've got a helicopter who can fly you back to a hospital, back to a surgeon, back to someone like me, who can then take that tourniquet off and deal with the injury within a certain time frame. The problem you have in Ukraine is you haven't got that scenario. Because of the lack of air superiority, because of drone warfare, these people have tourniquets on for 5, 6, 10, 12, 24 hours because they can't be moved back to the next line of medical support, which means they are having a much higher level of amputation in terms of rate, but also where they get amputated where the tourniquet is often high on the leg or the arm. So they're having amputations that are having much greater impact. And as you say, because the tourniquets have been on for a long time, that stops the blood flow to the leg, which is obviously great because it stops you bleeding out, but also means that muscle will die. When that muscle dies, it releases a whole load of poisons that will kill your kidneys. And so you're right there. They're having a much higher rate than we would have seen before of kidney injuries. And so this is how warfare changes. Drone warfare wasn't a thing when we were fighting in Afghanistan. It's a massive thing now. The whole mantra now, how you conduct warfare going forward will be different. And so the medical consequences will be different. And that's something we need to learn. They are learning things, developing their response in a way that we would not have predicted. And if we want to be even thinking about doing the kind of warfighting they're doing, we have to think about what are the new consequences and what are the new things we need to learn.
What do you think as a medic you can most take from your Ukrainian counterparts in terms of lessons learned?
So there are a couple of things which are probably quite depressing. I think the real thing I learned is that what you learned in the last war won't be applicable in the next war. The next war will produce new things that you need to react to, understand and deal with. So for example, in our last war, the infection was a problem, but we could deal with it because we have the right antibiotics, the right drugs, and the bugs we're treating were often killed by those antibiotics and those drugs. Now in Ukraine, they've got a problem where they've got bugs that are not killed by antibiotics. They're resistant to antibiotics. So what they are describing is going back to almost a First World War pre-antibiotic era of surgery where the antibiotics don't work anymore. And when you get a soldier, particularly with their time frames where they've had a tourniquet on for like 12 hours, they've had some kind of stabilization. They've then been put on a evacuation train or maybe a couple of days to the west of the country, and then you're picking them up in the west. These people have now wounds that are uncontrolled, infections that are uncontrolled and uncontrollable with antibiotics. And you have to revert to First World War techniques. So I guess what I'm saying is there are two things I learned from the experience with them. One, the next war will be different to the last war, and the lessons you will learn and the things you need to do will be different. And two, it's always worth looking back historically about what has been done in the past and how your predecessors who did the job you're doing now tackled their problems, because often there are things they did that you should be doing now.
So all eyes on the military historians, and that's why it's something that we've actually learned from the front lines in terms of it's back to trench warfare. We're looking at World War I style tactics there, but actually from how you apply your very technical medical approach to war fighting, maybe the same approach. One thing you've mentioned and you've been beating the drum for is a lot of Western focus is on supporting Ukraine, its militaries through donations of lethal aid. But perhaps now with the war entering a new phase, we're almost at the third year of fighting between Russia and Ukraine. Is it now time to start building proper plans as Western governments to support Ukraine with non-lethal aid as well? To say, as you were sort of talking about, maybe plan out the next decade of treatments so soldiers who have fought heroically aren't a burden on the state, for instance?
Totally. And I think when you're in the UK and you've got a small level number of soldiers and that burden is relatively contained, there's a moral component to dealing with those casualties of war effectively to make sure they are maintained in health, well-being, employment, etc., etc. But when you've got the scale that Ukraine has, it's more than just a moral component. There is an absolute economic societal component to make sure society functions afterwards because the volume is so high. So I think we're probably heading towards that inflection point. Then I think it's really important that Ukrainian society picks up the mantle of dealing with the consequences of their 3.5 years of war fighting, which is going to be human costs as well as all the other infrastructure costs, etc., etc. But the human cost is the one that almost most endures and probably has the most consequence because it's a lifetime burden. And we know from our own small experiences with our own military casualties that if you get it right, these people return to full function in terms of what they can do within society, employment, contribution to the economy, as well as being happy individuals, fulfilling themselves, leading meaningful lives. And if you don't, then they don't achieve that. And they end up being, as well as having pretty miserable lives and high rates of suicide and things like that, they become a burden and you will have to provide for them. So I think it's really important, both from the moral perspective and also from the societal economic perspective, that they make provision. Clearly, no one has the experience that Ukraine has in terms of volume and how wide it's affected and how it's not just their military who have been affected, their civilian population. But, there are things we can do to help them understand how to tackle the problem. Because in many ways, they can't afford to mess this up because the scale is so much. If they get it wrong, it will cost them both in terms of money spent, but also of lives not saved. So the more we can support them in developing that plan, the more we can help fund them, because it's going to need scaling of our existing resources. Just look at prosthetics, for example. There was, prior to the war, a prosthetic provision, so artificial limb provision within Ukraine. But clearly, compared to what is required now, and remember, that's not just a one-off artificial leg, that's you for the rest of your life needing an artificial leg. That's now going to have to be scaled probably tenfold, if not more. And trying to do that with just human resource and get someone who knows how to make the leg is not going to be feasible in terms of, timelines. So we need to be thinking about innovative ways to support them to meet their challenge. So one of the things you can do is, for example, instead of having someone literally sculpt a prosthetic leg, which is what we do traditionally now, you can 3D scan a leg and 3D print an artificial leg that can work. So I think there's lots of things that we can do to support them. But I think giving them a blueprint stroke roadmap or helping them develop their roadmap is important, but also helping them with that innovation and that kind of new way of tackling a new problem.
Yeah, you were speaking about sort of the British template, the European template, the American template. Is there an area from the Ukrainian template which you would like to see adopted into Britain's medical preparations for a war now?
So a bit like we've seen with their war fighting, they're really flexible, the Ukrainians, and they're really good at developing novel solutions, innovation, like drone warfare and things like this. This is a way of an overpowered military punching above its weight. And it's a really technologically and digitally enabled society. And I think there's some things they are developing around digital healthcare, technological advances to meet some of these needs, which we could really learn from. If you look at the Ukrainian population, for example, they already have digital apps for their healthcare records, their passport, their driving license. They don't carry these documents around, or never used to. It's always on a smartphone, it's digitized. And I think they're ahead of the curve compared to us on some of this. Digital is clearly one way you can scale things really quickly. And I think that's something we could translate back to the UK and Western healthcare systems. So one of the things we're working with them to try and develop is, can you have it almost like a digital tag, digital healthcare record that the soldiers hold? One thing they do keep is their phones, right? Because that's their lifeline to their family. So can they have something that's where their data is democratized? They hold their healthcare records. We can input into it, and that follows them back, and they own it, and they can then use that as when we're having conversations, not just immediately, but like long term. So people can say, like, what happened to you? Well, this will happen to me. And we've got a few projects kicking off around prosthetics and how we can help them do exactly that. How do you work out, well, how many people need artificial limbs? Where are they? What kind of limbs do they need? How are they functioning? All of this can be done using digital health technologies.
What are your views on whether we've been complacent about the potential demands of large-scale warfighting on military and civilian medical care at home?
Well, I mean, the short answer to that is, I don't think anyone really thought it would ever happen, or we'd ever be in a position where we would have to be meeting those challenges. And I think it's only since February 2022 we really thought, wow, this could happen. Because you look at what was happening strategically with the military and closing down the army on the Rhine, et cetera, clearly we're all sleepwalking into a scenario where we thought large-scale war in Europe will not happen again. There is no immediate threat to be locked into large-scale war fighting where you're dealing with hundreds, if not thousands, of casualties on a weekly basis.
We're now coming to final thoughts. Dom, do you want to start?
Yes, thanks, Adélie. Let's talk numbers again. Very difficult to talk numbers, casualty figures and what have you, but always a health check. However, we try to highlight them where we can and where we feel they are sensible. General Syrski's made a couple of comments. He says that in 2024, Russia suffered more losses than in the previous 2 years of the war. He says they lost over 434,000 personnel in 2024, including 150,000 killed. Now, today's report from Ukraine's General Staff says Russia has lost 820,430 troops in Ukraine since the start of the full-scale invasion. Now, as I've said before, Western officials over the years of this war now are content that Ukraine's numbers are not wildly inflated. So I think just for ease of maths, let's go with those figures for discussion purposes. So just over 820,000, that is about 180,000 until Russia hits 1 million casualties. 1 million, my God. Now, on current form of about 1,500 casualties a day, that's what the figure was, I think, for November and December, that is about 120 days. So mid-May. In mid-May, we're expecting Russia to pass the 1 million figure in terms of casualties. Just almost unimaginable. But I put it to you, just have a think about how hard Ukraine will be pushing the comms line if Russia's 1 million casualties figure happens on or around Russia's May Day parade on May the 9th. Can you imagine the narrative, the propaganda coup that would be for Ukraine? May the 9th, Russia's so-called Victory Day. Well, Putin likes to make a big song and dance about it. Just imagine if that is the day or the week or very close to the time when Russia passes 1 million casualties. And I would imagine very clever folk in Ukraine's comms and media departments are already working on that project. But just keep that one in your mind. Thanks, Adélie.
Thank you, Dom. Francis, you're up next.
Thanks, Adélie. A small story on which to end, certainly when measured in the grand scheme. But I think sometimes these small stories, you can read a lot into them. So as the Kyiv Independent report today, the Russian missile strike on Kyiv early on Saturday severely damaged Ukraine's oldest McDonald's restaurant. This is symbolic for, I think, several reasons, which is why it's been quite widely reported, not only in Ukraine but beyond. Indeed, one could write a whole history of Russia and Ukraine through their relationships with that fast food chain. As mentioned before, the opening of Moscow's first McDonald's on the 31st of January 1990 was very symbolic during the waning days of the Soviet Union. It was seen as a quintessential emblem of Western capitalism. It attracted immense public interest at the time, with thousands of Muscovites queuing in Pushkin Square to experience the novelty. That restaurant became a cultural phenomenon, serving over 30,000 customers on its first day, which was a global record at the time. Now, as a result of the full-scale invasion, McDonald's has entirely withdrawn from Russia, selling its franchises to someone who's no doubt made a killing producing the knockoff version, which we've reported on over the last couple of years. Meanwhile, Moscow bombs Ukraine's first McDonald's, which opened in 1997. Sometimes, as I've said before, the metaphors do write themselves.
Thank you, Francis. I will put in the show note a link to a podcast episode from NPR's show Invisibilia, which talks about when that first McDonald's opened in Moscow in 1990 and the cultural shock that it was to have American smiley optimism come face to face with the Soviet mindset. It's a fascinating listen. You'll find it in the show notes. Now, over to you, Joe, for your final thoughts.
Yeah, really interesting, Francis. And I would hate to work out how much I spent at that McDonald's on quick Big Macs while you're on the road reporting. The thing I'd like to mention is actually is inspired by Francis reporting on Gravehawk. And actually, it reminds me about how Boris Johnson, I can't remember where he was, but he came up and basically said, oh, look, Ukraine can strap brimstone missiles onto the back of small vehicles, small trucks, and then be used to launch at whatever targets they wish. And actually, this is just another example of now we're seeing Ukraine and actually probably the West like taking the adaptation that Ukraine and the innovation, that spirit in, and actually helping Ukraine achieve something new. And we can't just develop weapon systems completely from scratch, but actually there's lots of things that we can do, whether it be creating a ground launch platform for a surface, to create a surface-to-air missile rather than having using air-to-air missiles. There's just so much adaptation and innovation to be done, whether on the military side of things or, as I was speaking about, in healthcare. It's just that strikes me as something that we probably need to look at more, because, as I said, we're not going to be able to just create new weapons, new air defense systems completely from scratch. But what we can do is adapt and change weapons. They might not be as effective as Patriot system, but that's taken God knows how much and God knows how long to develop. But we can tweak and play around with things to give Ukraine effective weapons. And I think we should be doing more of that as the West.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Knowles. To support our work and to stay on top of all the Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 3 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine, the latest. Or sign up to Dispatches or Foreign Affairs newsletters, bringing stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a Ukraine live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on X Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on X, formerly known as Twitter, so that you don't miss it. To our listeners on YouTube, please note that due to issues beyond our control, there is sometimes a delay between broadcast and upload. So if you want to hear Ukraine the Latest as soon as it is released, do refer to podcast apps. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app and leave us with a review, as it really helps others find the show. Please also share it with those who may not be aware we exist. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We do continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on X. You can find our handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we are especially interested to hear where you're listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was today produced by Rachel Porter. Executive producers are Louisa Wells and David Knowles.